My name is Claire Whitman. I am 34, and when I look back, it always starts in that little room by the staircase my parents said was mine. They told me I was the strong one, the dependable one, so year after year, I learned to take less, to speak less, to expect less. At Christmas, my sister Emily was showered with praise and gifts while I was told to be grateful for whatever was left. I stayed quiet, believing loyalty would eventually earn me love. But sometimes silence grows heavy, and sometimes the child who was pushed into the shadows finds another way to step into the light. What happens when the voice no one wanted to hear becomes the one that can no longer be ignored? Stay with me, because this story will show you. Let me take you back to where it began. I was 8 years old when my parents decided the room by the staircase would be mine. It was not really a bedroom, more like a storage nook they had cleared out and tossed a twin mattress into. The walls smelled faintly of mildew, and in winter, the radiator clanked so loudly it felt like someone was banging on pipes with a hammer. In summer, the little box fan only pushed around hot air that carried the scent of wet plaster. My mother liked to say it was cozy, like something out of a fairy tale reading corner. I never argued. Upstairs, my sister Emily had 2 east-facing windows with lace curtains and a vanity covered in lip gloss tubes and posters of singers who looked nothing like us. Her room filled with morning light while mine stayed in shadow. At that age, I did not feel jealous, only tired. Everyone told me I was the strong one, so I learned to act like I did not need much. Every scrape or fever Emily had, I was the one carrying wet cloths and searching for Band-Aids in the bathroom cabinet. If she had the flu, I stayed home from school to watch her while Mom checked her phone and Dad read the newspaper. When I got sick, Mom would pat my shoulder, call me sweetheart, and tell me I would bounce back quickly. Then she would walk away already thinking about something else. One evening when I was 12, I gathered my courage and asked Dad if we could trade rooms for the summer. He was sitting at the kitchen table, newspaper folded in his hands. I told him Emily's room had more light and maybe I could use the space for my drawings and school projects. He did not even look up before answering. Emily's room has stairs, he said flatly. You want her falling down and breaking something. That was the end of it. A week later, I tripped carrying a laundry basket down the basement steps. I scraped my shin open and Mom shook her head, saying I should have been more careful. No one mentioned that the basement stairs were far more dangerous than Emily's carpeted staircase. I learned early that silence made things smoother. Asking only earned tight smiles or dismissals, so I kept quiet and focused on school. I brought home straight, as lined them up on the fridge until the magnets slipped. Emily's choir ribbons and soccer medals took up most of the space anyway. At night in that damp room by the staircase, I would press my pencil into paper and draw machines, little designs of gears and pulleys, things that made more sense than people ever did. One winter, the radiator screamed so loudly, I stuffed a towel against it just to get some sleep. Emily complained her room was too bright, that the sun woke her up too early. Mom kissed her forehead and said, "You poor thing, will get you blackout curtains." For me, nothing changed. The room had a crack that ran from ceiling to floor, splitting one wall like a scar. Sometimes I would trace it with my finger, imagining it might open and swallow me somewhere else. A place where I did not have to be the strong one, the silent one. The only warmth I found came from Mrs. Ellison next door. She was 70 then, with arthritis that made groceries difficult. I carried her bags up her porch steps after school. She would hand me a cookie wrapped in wax paper and tell me I was a blessing. Her words felt heavier and kinder than anything I heard inside my own house. I remember one night, Christmas lights strung across the street, Emily showing off a new dollhouse Dad had bought her. She squealed with delight and Mom clapped. I unwrapped a pair of socks, green and white, practical as always. Dad nodded at me, saying, "You'll use those." Everyone laughed like it was charming. I smiled too because that was what was expected. Later I slipped the socks under my pillow and told myself one day I would buy my own gifts. Emily always knew how to shine in a room. Her laughter floated, her dresses twirled, and the spotlight seemed to find her without effort. I stayed in the shadows listening, holding trays, cleaning up. Mom would beam and say, "Look at Emily, she has such presence." Then she would glance at me and murmur, "You're dependable, Claire." That word dependable sat in me like a stone. There were nights when I lay awake in that small room, the radiator hissing, and I thought about what it might feel like to be chosen first. To have someone say, "We are proud of you," without comparing me to Emily. I never heard those words. Instead I heard, "You'll figure it out. You're tough. You don't need much." One evening, Emily came running into my room crying because she had dropped a glass figurine she loved. It lay in shards in her hands. I sat with her on the mattress, picked up the pieces, and whispered that we could glue it back together. She fell asleep, curled against me safe, while my own cut finger bled onto the bedsheet. In the morning she woke up cheerful again, racing upstairs to show Mom her fixed figurine. No one asked how I had spent the night. By the time I turned 14, I stopped, hoping the room would change. I hung my drawings along the cracked wall-built shelves out of leftover boards and carved a corner that felt like mine even if no one else believed it. The fan still pushed stale air, but when I sat cross-legged with my notebooks, I imagined a different kind of house. One I would build myself. Years later, I can still remember the sound of that radiator, the smell of damp plaster, the way the cracks split the wall like it was marking time. That room taught me how to carry silence like armor, how to endure without complaint. It was not love, but it was survival. And survival was the only gift my family seemed willing to give me. It was a December evening in Dallas, when the house glowed with colored lights and the smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Emily wore a red velvet dress with white trim twirling in front of the fireplace as relatives clapped. She looked like a picture out of a holiday card, her hair curled neatly, a bow pinned just right. Mom stood beside her, adjusting the ribbon on her waist, whispering how beautiful she looked. I sat cross-legged near the tree, tugging at the hem of my plain sweater, waiting for the stack of gifts to make its way toward me. Dad handed Emily a large box wrapped in silver paper. She tore it open and squealed. Inside was a porcelain dollhouse with tiny furniture, the kind I had only seen in department store windows. Everyone leaned in to admire it. My aunt gasped, my uncle whistled, and Mom smiled wide. When it was my turn, Dad slid a smaller package across the carpet. The paper crinkled easily under my hands, and inside I found a plastic sketch pad with dull-colored pencils, the type sold in the discount aisle. I lifted it out and forced a smile. Dad said, "You'll use that." A few chuckled, and the attention swung back to Emily and her dollhouse. I traced the edges of my sketch pad and reminded myself it was better than nothing. Still, a part of me ached, wondering what it might feel like to have a gift that made the room cheer for me. After dinner, Mom gathered us near the piano where she played carols. Emily sang along, her clear voice floating through the room. Relatives applauded when she finished Silent Night, and Dad kissed her forehead. I joined in the singing, too softer, almost drowned out by the laughter around me. No one noticed. Later that night, I helped clear dishes from the long dining table. My cousin Kyle stacked plates high, then slipped away to watch television. I stayed behind, scrubbing grease off pans, while Mom scolded me for leaving water spots. I nodded, rinsed again, and said nothing. Upstairs, Emily showed off her new dollhouse to a cluster of cousins. I lingered in the hallway, watching them kneel on her carpet, adjusting miniature chairs and tables. Emily tossed her hair and laughed as if she were hosting a party in her own private kingdom. When she caught me staring, she shut the door. Back in my small room, I sat cross-legged on the mattress, opened the sketch pad, and tried the pencils. The tips broke easily, leaving faint marks. I pressed harder until the page nearly tore. The radiator rattled and hissed like a voice mocking me. I set the pencils aside and pulled my blanket tight, promising myself that one day my Christmas would look different. The following week at school, kids swapped stories about what they got for the holiday. Emily boasted about her dollhouse, describing the chandelier that lit up when you pressed a button. My classmates gasped. When they turned to me, I said, "I got a sketch pad." They nodded politely and went back to asking Emily questions. At recess, I sat alone on the swings. My best friend at the time, Mariah, wandered over and asked why I looked so glum. I shrugged, then admitted I wished I had a gift that made people proud. She kicked at the dirt and said, Not everything has to sparkle to matter. I held on to her words like they were a secret. That Christmas stayed etched in my memory, not because of the dollhouse or the songs, but because it showed me the difference between being noticed and being useful. Emily was celebrated and I was expected to be steady. On New Year's Eve, our neighborhood threw a block party. Families gathered on front lawns sipping cider, kids waving sparklers. Emily wore a sequin jacket that caught the glow of streetlights. I wore my old coat, the zipper stuck halfway. Dad patted Emily's shoulder when neighbors complimented her voice from the carols. When one man asked if I had any talents, Dad chuckled and said, "She's dependable." Everyone laughed as if it were a punchline. I slipped away and sat on the curb with my knees pulled tight to my chest, watching fireworks explode above. They painted the sky in colors that felt out of reach. I whispered to myself that one day I would make something brighter than fireworks, something that lasted longer than applause. The days after school resumed were quieter. I buried myself in homework, solving equations faster than my classmates, staying late in the library to read books on machines and engines. Teachers praised me, but the compliments never made it home. When I showed Mom a certificate for winning the regional science fair, she smiled quickly, then added, "Emily has a choir recital next week, we need to focus on that." Dad nodded without glancing up from his paper. Emily beamed. I tucked the certificate back into my backpack and carried it upstairs. In the privacy of my cracked-walled room, I taped the certificate above my bed. It leaned slightly because the tape peeled, but I stared at it each night. It was proof, at least to me, that I had something worth holding on to. One snowy morning, Emily caught a cold and Mom panicked. She called out from the kitchen for me to stay home and keep watch. I sat beside Emily on the couch, holding tissues to her nose, spooning soup into her hands while she pouted. The phone rang all day, Mom chatting away while I mopped spills and wiped Emily's forehead. By evening, Emily felt better and skipped up the stairs singing. Mom thanked her for being brave. No one thanked me. That night, lying in bed with the radiator hammering away, I realized survival was not enough. I wanted more than to scrape by unnoticed. I wanted to be seen. The crack in the wall seemed deeper than before. I traced it with my finger and thought about all the Christmas mornings ahead. I wondered if they would all look the same. And yet, even in that silence, a small voice inside whispered that the story was not finished. By the time I was 18, I had filled the cracked wall of my little room with ribbons of paper taped together, each one carrying test scores, certificates, or scribbled notes from teachers who told me I had potential. They meant more to me than any gift I had ever opened. I spent late nights with textbooks stacked around me, memorizing formulas under the rattle of the radiator, imagining what life might look like beyond Dallas. The letter from UC San Diego arrived in early spring of my senior year. I held the envelope like it might disappear if I breathed too hard. When I slid it open and read the words scholarship and acceptance, my knees went weak. For the first time, I allowed myself to laugh out loud. I ran a finger over the page, trying to believe that someone far away thought I was worth investing in. At dinner that night, I waited for the right moment. Emily was telling a long story about being chosen to sing a solo in choir. Dad listened, nodding at intervals. Mom passed around the mashed potatoes, smiling proudly at her. I waited until there was a lull, and then said softly that I had been accepted to UC San Diego with a full scholarship. The silence that followed was heavy. Dad frowned, asking if that was the one near Los Angeles. Mom pursed her lips and said California was far, as if distance itself was a flaw. Emily stabbed at her green beans and asked if I was really planning on leaving her. Mom patted her wrist and promised they would figure things out. No one congratulated me. No one raised a glass. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, holding the acceptance letter against my chest. I told myself their reaction did not matter, that I was going. Still, a part of me longed for even a small acknowledgement, a moment of pride that never came. The months before August passed in quiet preparation. I packed what little I owned into 2 suitcases and a laundry bag. Emily cried one afternoon, saying I was selfish for leaving, that the house would feel wrong without me. She did not offer to help me fold a single shirt. Mom packed me a turkey sandwich the morning I left, her face tight, like she was holding words back. Dad honked the car horn outside instead of coming in. When we reached the airport, he did not bother getting out. I hauled my bags onto the curb myself. He muttered about traffic and waved half-heartedly before pulling away. I stood there with my duffel clutched to my chest, watching the car disappear into the flow of vehicles. No hug, no goodbye, just exhaust in the air. The plane ride west felt like stepping into another universe. The moment I walked out of the San Diego airport, the air hit me dry and bright with a faint smell of salt and jasmine. It was nothing like the heavy humidity of Dallas. The campus at UCSD stretched wide concrete buildings, softened by palm trees, and the Pacific shimmered in the distance. My dorm room was barely bigger than my nook at home, but it had a window that let in streams of golden light each morning. For the first time in my life, the space around me felt like mine. I pinned the acceptance letter on the corkboard above my desk and taped my old science fair certificate beside it. Proof that I belonged here. The first weeks were overwhelming. Students hurried across campus with laptops and iced coffees, talking about projects that sounded like another language. I kept my head down, attended every lecture, and took notes until my hand cramped. At night, I walked to the library, staying until closing, letting the smell of books and the hum of computers steady me. I called home a few times at first. Mom answered once, launching into a story about Emily joining the student council. She never asked about my classes. Dad never picked up. Eventually, I stopped dialing. Instead, I found small pockets of belonging in San Diego. I worked a part-time job at the campus library shelving books, earning just enough for groceries and a second-hand bike. I made friends with a girl named Priya from my computer science lab who studied late into the night like me. We shared cheap ramen in the common kitchen, laughing about professors who mumbled through slides. The more time passed, the more I realized how far I had come. Back in Dallas, I had been invisible. Here, professors praised my logic, and classmates asked for my help debugging code. Each success felt like a light turning on inside me. One evening, I stood outside my dorm as the sun dipped into the ocean. The sky burned orange, and the air was cool against my skin. I thought of Emily's dollhouse, of Dad's dismissive words, of Mom telling me to stay strong. For the first time, I believed I could build something entirely my own, something no one could laugh away. When I returned to my room, I opened my laptop and began sketching out an idea for a project that would later change everything. At the time, it was just lines of code and half-formed thoughts. But it was mine. The crack in the wall of my childhood room no longer loomed over me. Instead, I stared at a window open to the Pacific breeze. The silence had followed me here, but it was different now. It no longer pressed me down. It gave me space to grow. And in that space, for the first time, I started to feel like my life was finally beginning. The summer after my sophomore year, I landed an internship at a small software company in downtown San Diego. The office had once been a surf shop with wide windows that still smelled faintly of salt and coffee. Whiteboards lined the walls, beanbags sat unused in the corners, and everyone worked on laptops perched on mismatched desks. I was just another intern blending into the hum of code and chatter until I met Daniel Brooks. He was older than the rest of us, maybe 37, with rumpled shirts and a voice that carried authority without trying. He was the lead developer, and unlike others who nodded politely at my work, Daniel asked questions. When I presented a solution during the Monday stand-up, he didn't just say, "Nice job." He pulled me aside and asked me to walk him through the logic step by step. His attention felt like sunlight hitting a corner of me that had always stayed in shadow. We stayed late a few nights, combing through algorithms on a shared screen, debating approaches until the janitor shut off the hall lights. He never made me feel small. Instead, he pushed me because he believed I could handle it. That summer, I learned more from him than from any textbook. When the internship ended, I received 2 offers from bigger firms, shiny logos and promises of stability. But Daniel asked me to stay with the small company part-time while I finished my degree. I chose his team. For once, I trusted my instinct, not the voices of people who would never understand. By graduation, I was working full-time. The company was modest but hungry, shifting toward fintech. One afternoon, over burritos in the break room, I floated an idea about an app that could help hourly wage workers track paychecks, automate bill payments, and avoid overdraft fees. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. "Tell me more," he said. 4 months later, we quit our jobs and registered an LLC. We called it Clear Ledger. The first 6 weeks, we worked out of my apartment, surviving on instant noodles and instant coffee. My kitchen table became our headquarters, wires and monitors snaking across the surface. When we hit 10,000 downloads, we celebrated with tacos from a truck on Garnet Avenue, raising cans of lime soda like they were champagne. Clear Ledger felt like the first thing in my life that truly belonged to me. Users wrote emails thanking us for helping them avoid fees. A young mother said she could finally budget for her daughter's braces. Every message lit something inside me. But the growth brought pressure. Investors circled, eager for returns. Daniel began taking calls in private, his voice low in conference rooms while I crunched numbers alone. When I asked what the conversations were about, he waved me off, saying I worried too much. The first cracks appeared when I noticed changes in our code repository. New branches, unfamiliar comments, features I hadn't approved. When I confronted Daniel, he shrugged and said he was just testing ideas. Still, something in his tone unsettled me. One Thursday morning in 2018, I opened my inbox to an email that hadn't been meant for me. The subject line read "Term Sheet Review, Brightwave FinTech." My breath caught as I scrolled. It was a draft contract with one of our closest competitors, the same company that had offered to buy us months earlier. I had refused. Daniel had not. I stared at the screen until the cursor blinked itself into nothing. My hands shook as I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The San Diego air was bright and cruelly calm, as if mocking the storm in my chest. Over the next 2 weeks, everything unraveled. Our main investor withdrew after learning Daniel had signed on with Brightwave. A second followed. Payroll loomed and we had no funds. I called an emergency meeting in the break room, the one with the broken coffee machine humming in the corner. I told the team the truth. No tears, just facts. We could not pay them next month. I promised to write recommendations to connect them with contacts. One by one, they left, faces drawn, until the office was empty. I stayed until midnight, packing up wires, notebooks, and the small orchid Daniel had given me. It had already wilted. On the glass door, our logo gleamed faintly. I unscrewed the sign with a screwdriver, the sound small but final. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the sign across my knees, and let myself feel it. Failure. Betrayal. The end of something I had thought would carry me into the future. Outside, cars passed on Broadway, headlights slicing the dark. Somewhere across town, Daniel was likely celebrating his new contract. I walked home alone, the sign heavy under my arm. In my apartment, the heater rattled and I sat at the table that once held our dream. I opened a fresh notebook and began sketching again. Lines, arrows, messy code fragments. Not to start over yet, but to remind myself I still had something inside. The betrayal cut deeper than I admitted, but beneath the grief a quiet certainty stirred. I was not done. And when the night stretched long and still, I promised myself that one day I would build something stronger, and no one would take it from me. The weeks after Clear Ledger collapsed felt like walking through fog. My phone stopped buzzing, emails slowed, and the silence that once gave me space now pressed heavy on my chest. I still woke at 5 a.m. out of habit, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of burnt coffee, sketching ideas on scraps of paper. The ideas were messy, half-formed, but they kept me from sinking. One evening at a small networking event in San Jose, I met Rachel Moore. She was 34, sharp-eyed, with a quick laugh that cut through the awkwardness of the room. She had been working as a machine learning engineer at a major bank, but her stories were full of frustration. She told me how her predictive models were watered down by executives who only cared about short-term numbers. I listened, and for the first time since Daniel, I felt a flicker of trust. We started meeting at coffee shops, scribbling algorithms on napkins, talking about ways to design a platform that could adapt to people's lives instead of punishing them for being broke. The idea grew between us like a living thing. Soon after, we brought in Marcus Lee, a compliance expert in his late 30s who despised bureaucracy but loved clarity. He balanced our technical dreams with the hard edge of legality. We named it Lumen Pay, not officially at first, just a word Rachel tossed out one night. Lanterns light the way, she said. It stuck. The three of us worked out of borrowed conference rooms and my tiny apartment. I sold my old car to buy a server and lived off canned soup for months. Rachel, coated with headphones on, swaying to music no one else could hear, while Marcus scribbled policies on yellow legal pads. I obsessed over design, staying awake until dawn, refining the user flow. 6 months in, we launched a quiet beta with a waiting list. No press, no flashy announcements, just a promise to listen. Users trickled in, curious and cautious. One man wrote that for the first time, he could set aside money for his daughter's braces. I read the message in my kitchen and felt tears sting my eyes. We fixed bugs in real time, answering support emails ourselves. The app began to spread by word of mouth. Grants trickled in, then a small investment from an incubator. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stop eating instant noodles every night. By our second year, we had crossed 100,000 users. Rachel became the public face, speaking at meetups and panels. She hated the spotlight but understood why I wanted it that way. I had no desire to put my name out there again. Daniel had taught me that visibility invited vultures. Still, growth meant pressure. Venture capital firms circled, promising the moon. We stalled them, determined to strengthen the foundation first. Marcus drilled us on compliance, Rachel polished the models, and I sat hunched over my laptop, making sure every click and button worked the way it should. Sometimes late at night, Rachel would glance at me and say, "You could take credit, you know. People should know this is yours." I shook my head. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." She sighed but never pushed. We celebrated milestones with cheap tacos and sparkling water, laughing like kids. I taped our first grant check on the wall above my desk as a reminder of where we had started. The difference this time was trust. Rachel and Marcus were not perfect, but they were steady. The name Lumen Pay spread slowly into industry newsletters. Users recommended us to friends. Journalists began asking who was behind the platform. Rachel always said we were a collaborative team. That answer was enough for a while. Still, there were nights I lay awake wondering how long I could stay hidden. The crack in the wall of my childhood room no longer haunted me, but another crack threatened to form. The pull between wanting recognition and fearing it. One evening, sitting on the fire escape outside our borrowed workspace, Rachel handed me a soda and said, "Do you ever think about what your family would say if they saw this?" I stared out at the streetlights and shook my head. "They would not see me," I said quietly. "They never did." She clinked her can against mine and said, "Then let the world see you instead." I smiled faintly but stayed silent. The world could wait. For now, building was enough. And as the months rolled on, every new user felt like a brick in the fortress I had promised myself. I would build strong enough that no one could ever take it from me again. By 2022, our small office in downtown San Jose was buzzing with more than just the whir of laptops. We had grown past the stage of folding chairs and sticky notes taped to walls. A new espresso machine hissed in the corner, bought secondhand, but still reliable, and interns rotated through, eager to learn. Lumen Pay was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming something people recognized. The growth came with eyes we did not expect. A journalist reached out after spotting our name in a financial literacy blog. Rachel deflected, saying we were a team effort and preferred not to highlight individuals. It should have ended there, but the article mentioned her as the spokesperson and hinted at a mysterious founder in the background. That was enough to start whispers. One Friday evening, Rachel called me over to her desk. She tilted her screen so I could see the headline. "Who is the architect behind Lumen Pay's adaptive engine?" My stomach tightened. She glanced at me. "Do you want me to respond?" I shook my head. "Let them guess." I thought that would be the end of it, but a week later, a podcast episode surfaced online. Someone had clipped audio from an internal panel I had spoken at months earlier, intended only for onboarding new hires. My voice described the motivation behind Lumen Pay. Sometimes when you're told enough times you don't belong at the table, you stop asking for a seat. You build your own room. Hearing my own words out of context felt like being exposed. The host referred to me only as N. Callahan, but people online began connecting dots. A Reddit thread popped up filled with speculation. Some praised the anonymity, others demanded to know the real face. My phone buzzed all night with notifications I had not asked for. Marcus noticed my silence the next morning. He slid a cup of coffee toward me and said quietly, "You can either let them chase shadows, or you can set the record straight." I stared at the cup steam curling into the air and said, "I am not ready." He nodded and dropped the subject. For weeks I lived with the unease of being half-revealed. At conferences, Rachel was asked about me directly. She smiled and repeated our mantra that we were a collaborative team. Investors hinted that they wanted to meet the mind behind the engine. I stayed hidden, insisting that the code and the outcomes were enough. But the questions did not stop. One afternoon, a young reporter showed up in the lobby unannounced. She asked to speak with me by name. The receptionist froze, unsure what to do. I told her to send the reporter away, but the encounter left me rattled. That night, Rachel and I sat on the fire escape watching the city lights flicker below. She nudged my shoulder. "You know, hiding forever might not be possible." I stared out at the street and whispered, "If they know me, they'll drag my family into it." She didn't press, but her silence felt like understanding. Despite the whispers, Lumen Pay kept growing. We hit 500,000 users, then more. Each milestone came with pressure to raise larger rounds of funding. Venture capital firms circled wanting equity control and visibility. I resisted, insisting we needed more time to strengthen the foundation. Rachel and Marcus backed me, though I could see the strain in their eyes. The pressure culminated at a fintech summit in San Francisco. We had a small booth, nothing fancy, just a looping demo on a monitor and a bowl of mints we forgot to refill. Rachel gave our presentation to a packed audience. She spoke with steady confidence, outlining our vision and walking through the platform's capabilities. During the Q&A, a man in a pinstripe blazer raised his hand. He skipped any introduction and asked bluntly, "Who designed the adaptive logic grid?" Rachel glanced at me in the audience. I shook my head slightly. She smiled and said, "We are a collaborative team." The man smirked and said, "Funny, because the patent filing lists N. Callahan as the lead contributor." A ripple ran through the room. My throat tightened as I sat frozen in my chair. Rachel didn't flinch. "Yes," she said evenly, "that's correct." The man scanned the audience. "Is she here?" The silence stretched, and I kept my eyes on the carpet. My palms were damp. Rachel shifted seamlessly back to the demo, pulling up a live dashboard. The crowd leaned forward again, distracted by the real-time adjustments. The moment passed, but I felt its weight pressing down on me. Afterward, in the hallway, Rachel handed me a bottle of water. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though my pulse was still racing. "You don't owe anyone your name," she said softly. "You built something better than that." That night, I walked along the Embarcadero, the bay bridge lights twinkling across the water. The breeze carried the scent of salt and diesel. I thought about how many years I had spent invisible, first in that damp room in Dallas, then in the shadow of Clear Ledger, and now again by choice. Recognition was tempting, but freedom was sweeter. The next morning, we woke to our first serious acquisition offer. It was flattering, even validating, but I told Marcus and Rachel we weren't ready. Not yet. We still had more to build, more to prove. The questions about me would keep coming, I knew that. But as long as Lumen Pay held steady, as long as people kept writing to say the app had made their lives easier, I could live with the whispers. For the first time, the silence was not suffocating. It was mine to keep, and I chose it. By the spring of 2023, the acquisition with Horizon Capital had closed, and the wire transfers were complete. The numbers in my account felt unreal strings of digits that looked more like theory than truth. I sat with my lawyer in a quiet office on Market Street, listening as he slid a stack of documents across the table. "Everything is final," he said. "You are the sole owner of the Malibu property." I nodded, fingers brushing the heavy paper, the words echoing in my mind. Sole owner. When I first drove up the coastal road toward the house, the sky was still pink with sunrise. The gates opened with a soft buzz, revealing a stretch of white walls and glass perched above the ocean. Inside, the marble floors gleamed the air, faintly smelled of polish, and the wide windows framed nothing but blue horizon. For a long moment, I just stood there barefoot, letting the silence wrap around me. This time, it was not a silence of neglect. It was a silence of arrival. I wandered room to room, tracing my fingers along smooth oak railings, opening closets lined with empty shelves. The bedroom faced the sea, the curtains shifting gently in the breeze. Downstairs, the kitchen held a counter long enough to prepare meals for 10, though I cooked only for myself. I opened the terrace door, stepped outside, and leaned on the stone railing as waves rolled steady below. For once, I felt no urgency to explain myself to anyone. The first night in Malibu, I slept deeply, no radiator clanging, no footsteps overhead. Only the sound of the ocean breathing against the cliffs. In the morning, I padded through the halls with coffee in hand, marveling that I had built this from nights of coding in tiny apartments, from years of being told to stay quiet. But wealth does not erase memory. Some evenings, I found myself standing in the smallest room off the staircase, the one the realtor had called storage. It reminded me of my childhood nook, except this space had skylights and fresh paint. I turned it into a studio, lining it with bookshelves and a drafting table. I named it The Left of the Stairwell, a private joke and a reminder. Later, I would use that name for a scholarship fund, but in those first weeks, it was just a room where I could finally breathe without waiting for permission. Emails from Horizon piled up with requests for press appearances. I declined each one. Rachel handled the interviews, Marcus the compliance calls. My name stayed absent from the announcements. Investors called it stealth. I called it peace. One Thursday morning, I sat at the terrace with my laptop open when an email landed in my inbox. The subject line read Strategic Collaboration Opportunity. At first, I almost deleted it, but the sender's name stopped me. It was Emily. My sister had used her personal address, not her PR firm's. I clicked it open and read her words. She wrote that her media presence had suffered from false accusations by a few misinformed clients. She said she was rebuilding her brand and seeking partnerships in wellness and financial empowerment. Lumen Pay had caught her attention, and she wanted to connect directly with the founder. There was no mention of the birthday years ago when she told me to get out, no acknowledgement of the silence that followed, only a polished request. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing a brief reply. Thank you for your interest. We have passed your request to the relevant department. If there is alignment, someone will be in touch. I signed nothing. Later that afternoon, Marcus flagged the email in our internal system and asked if I wanted him to respond officially. Let it drop, I typed back. By Monday, her name was everywhere again, but not for the reasons she hoped. A boutique fitness chain in Denver posted a complaint on Instagram, accusing her of taking payment for workshops she never delivered. They tagged industry accounts, then tagged us. Within hours, the story spread. Emily's brand partnerships began issuing statements cutting ties. I watched it all from my patio, sea breeze lifting my hair, fire pit flickering beside me. I did not respond publicly. The internet did what it always does, digging up old videos and connecting fragments. Someone found a clip from Emily's 30th birthday, the one where she raised her glass and told me to leave. A guest had filmed the cake, and in the background you could hear her voice sharp as glass. Get out. Then came the laughter of my parents, captured forever. The video resurfaced and spread like wildfire. I closed my laptop and set it aside. Inside the house, the light shifted golden against the walls. I made myself tea, stood by the window, and watched the tide crawl in. I felt no gloating, no triumph, only a deep stillness. The empire they had built on appearances was beginning to crack, and I had not lifted a finger. When the sun slipped below the horizon, I returned to the terrace, wrapped myself in a blanket, and listened to the waves. I thought of the girl who once huddled in a damp room by the staircase, holding cheap-colored pencils that broke under pressure. She had wanted so badly to be seen. Now the world was finally looking, but not at Emily's curated stage. They were seeing the truth. and for the first time I realized I did not need to explain who I was. The work spoke louder than any family name ever could. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope with my mother's handwriting across the front. The script leaned too far to the right, as if the letters themselves were impatient. Inside was a glossy card, printed with gold foil, that read, "Join us to celebrate Emily's 35th birthday." On the back was a photo of her in a blue silk dress, holding a glass of wine, as if she were toasting the whole world. Beneath it, Mom had written, "Hope you can make it home, Claire. Home." The word sat on the page like a lie. Still, I placed the card on my desk beside a half-written proposal and stared at it for a long time. A part of me wanted to toss it in the trash, but another part whispered that maybe it was time. Not for them, but for me. On the day of the party, I flew into Dallas on a late morning flight. The humidity wrapped around me like a damp blanket the moment I stepped outside the terminal. I carried a small suitcase and a bottle of Cabernet from a Santa Rosa vineyard tucked carefully in a paper bag. From the closet in Malibu, I had also pulled out a watercolor painting. My mother once loved an image of reeds and a quiet lake, she used to say, reminded her of Vermont. I thought it might soften the edges of what I knew was coming. The Whitman house looked the same as when I left years ago. Blue shutters, gravel driveway, wind chimes tangled on the porch. Balloons were tied to the railing, swaying in the warm breeze. I knocked. My father opened the door. His hair had thinned and lines carved deep into his face, but his eyes still carried that mix of authority and distance. For a moment he simply stared, then said, "You came." I lifted the wine and painting. Figured she had enough candles. He chuckled lightly, not warm, not cold, just unsure, and stepped aside to let me in. Inside the house pulsed with music and laughter. Emily stood near the fireplace, in a white dress that shimmered under the lights. People orbited around her as if she were the center of gravity. Mom approached me with a smile practiced too well. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I replied, handing her the painting. She blinked, then smiled, for real. "You kept this." I nodded. "I remembered you loved it." She squeezed my hand briefly before turning away to greet another guest. I stayed near the hallway for a while, sipping wine and watching from the periphery. A few cousins waved. Aunt Janice asked if I was still doing tech things. I said yes and let it hang there. Dinner was served in the backyard under strings of lights. Long tables stretched across the lawn set with china and crystal. I found a seat at the far end, away from the spotlight. Toasts began, glasses lifted. Mom raised hers first to my beautiful girl who has never stopped making us proud. Dad followed, saying Emily had always been the light of the family. I kept my face calm, sipping my wine, though each word pressed like a weight against my chest. Then Emily stood again, holding her glass with both hands. "And let's not forget my big sister Claire, who disappeared for years." She grinned. "Seriously, where did you go?" "Witness protection." A few guests chuckled. "No headlines, no interviews, no TED Talks. Did you get abducted by monks?" I set my glass down carefully. She raised her voice. "Come on, Claire. Share something. Remind us you exist." The gravel beneath my chair crunched as I pushed it back. Emily blinked at me. "If you can't be part of the celebration, maybe you shouldn't be here." I turned toward the gate, my steps steady. Behind me, her voice snapped sharp as a whip. "Get out!" The laughter that followed stung more than her words. Mom laughed softly, as if brushing off static. Dad smirked into his wine. No one stopped me. No one called after me. I walked through the gate without slamming it, the sound of wind chimes clattering above the porch. At the curb, I opened the rideshare app, hands trembling not with anger but with disbelief. After all these years, nothing had changed. A car pulled up and I slid into the back seat. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. "Long night," I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. We drove past the highway sign, then the airport exit. In my lap, the bottle of wine remained unopened, its glass cold against my palms. By the time the plane lifted into the night sky, I felt the last thread snap. Dallas shrank below, lights scattering across the dark. I leaned my head against the window and whispered to myself that I was finally done asking for their approval. When I landed in Los Angeles before dawn, the air was cool and salted faintly by the ocean. My driver was waiting, greeting me by name. We wound up the coastal road as the horizon turned pink. The Malibu house stood silent, waiting. I entered the code, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The marble floors glowed in the early light. I set my suitcase down and walked barefoot to the terrace. The ocean stretched wide and endless gulls circling above. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to defend myself, no weight of expectation. Only the certainty that I had chosen the right door to walk through, and it was not theirs. The weeks after Dallas felt like walking through a world that had finally gone quiet. I worked from the studio by the stairwell, papers stacked high, and sketches pinned to the wall, sunlight spilling through the skylight. The scholarship fund paperwork lay open on my desk, ready for signatures. It was the kind of legacy I wanted to leave, one that reached girls like me who had been told to wait their turn, to sit in the corner, to hold the family together without complaint. Yet the world outside my house refused to stay still. Emily's scandal deepened. News outlets replayed the Denver fitness complaints, then uncovered lawsuits from clients in Chicago and Phoenix. A podcast interviewed one of her former assistants, who spoke about unpaid wages and empty promises. I didn't chase the stories, but I couldn't escape them either. Her name trended on Twitter, hashtags spiraling in every direction. Then came the call I hadn't expected. It was a weekday afternoon, and I was folding laundry by the upstairs window when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice on the other end was shaky, raw. Claire. It was Emily. I said nothing, just held the phone to my ear. She hesitated, then asked, "Is it true that you're the one behind Lumen Pay?" I let the silence stretch until she rushed to fill it. "They're saying you knew everything, that you built it while I was..." She trailed off and her breath cracked like she was swallowing glass. I finally spoke. "I didn't plan the scandal, Emily. But I did build the thing that works, and I stayed quiet while it grew." There was no reply, just one long breath before the line went dead. I stood there with the folded sweater slipping from my arms, staring out at the ocean that kept rolling regardless. 2 days later, my mother called. Her tone was sharp, brittle with accusation. "So this is how you get back at us." She didn't even bother with hello. I pressed the phone between my shoulder and ear as I continued stacking dishes into the cabinet. "I'm not getting back at anyone," I said calmly. "I'm living my life." She scoffed. "You knew what that podcast would do, the way you let them connect the dots. You could have stopped it." "No," I answered. "I didn't start the fire. I just didn't put it out for you." Her inhale was sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you're above this family now?" I closed the cabinet gently. "I think I outgrew the idea that family means staying silent while being stepped on." She went quiet, and I could almost hear her pacing the old kitchen in Dallas, the same linoleum floor where I once stood, invisible beside Emily. "What do you want from us, Claire?" she finally asked. "Nothing," I said. "And that's what makes this so hard for you, isn't it?" She hung up without another word. I placed the phone on the counter and leaned against the cool granite, not angry, not triumphant, just empty, in a way that felt final. The following week, a letter arrived in stiff black ink. My father's handwriting, uneven, and pressed too hard against the paper. Inside was a glittering birthday card, the kind sold at the drugstore checkout. "Happy birthday," it read, though he spelled my name wrong. Not Claire, but Clara, the same slip he used to make when talking about the neighbor's daughter with straight A's and tennis trophies. I slid the card back into the envelope and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk beneath the deed to the Malibu property. Some part of me wanted to believe it meant he was reaching out, but the rest of me knew better. It was the same as it had always been, a reminder that they never bothered to see me clearly. Meanwhile, Horizon Capital pushed for a presentation to the board of potential partners. They wanted a clear picture of our long-term strategy and a public showcase of our engine. Rachel and Marcus argued that it was time to step forward, that my silence had served its purpose. I resisted at first, but eventually I agreed. Not for them, not even for me, but for the work. On the morning of the presentation, I stood in the mirror adjusting a simple navy blazer. My hair fell loose around my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I looked at my reflection without flinching. In the conference center downtown, the room buzzed with suits and screens, investors sipping expensive coffee, analysts tapping on tablets. Rachel introduced me simply as our lead engineer and strategist. A ripple moved through the audience, whispers sparking. Some recognized the name from the patent filing. Others were connecting dots in real time. I walked to the front, laptop in hand, and plugged into the projector. The first slides were calm. Charts, user growth, testimonials from families who had saved money for the first time in years. Then came the live demo. The adaptive engine adjusted in real time as I changed variables on the screen. Gasps scattered across the room, pens stopped moving. For once, all eyes were on me, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as the builder of something real. When I paused for questions, the silence stretched long and heavy, just like the silence I had grown up with. But this time, it wasn't dismissive. It was awe. I closed the laptop slowly, feeling the air shift around me. In that moment, I knew the story had turned, though the reckoning had only just begun. The applause rose slowly, almost cautiously, then filled the conference hall until it echoed against the glass walls. I stood there steady, not smiling, just letting the sound wash over me. For years, silence had been the only language my family gave me, and now it was being rewritten into something else entirely. Rachel squeezed my shoulder as I stepped off the stage, her voice low in my ear. "They finally saw you." Backstage, Marcus was already fielding calls from journalists. Reporters wanted quotes, camera crews lingered by the doors, and emails poured in faster than our team could sort them. I slipped out a side exit into the cool air, my chest rising with something I could not name. Relief, maybe. Or justice. 2 days later, the first articles hit the front page of major business outlets. Not Rachel, not Marcus, not Horizon Capital, but my name. Claire Whitman, the hidden architect behind Lumen Pay. Photos from the presentation spread across networks, my face caught mid-sentence, with the engine projected behind me. The story framed me as the quiet founder who had stepped into the light. That same morning, I received a letter from our legal counsel. Enclosed were documents tied to Emily. Subpoenas had been issued in 2 states for fraudulent business practices. Clients were demanding repayment. One of her partners had filed a civil suit claiming breach of contract and misappropriation of funds. I read the pages at my kitchen table, the ocean rolling beyond the terrace. A week later, another blow landed. Horizon's compliance team uncovered that my father had been serving on an advisory board connected to one of Emily's companies, quietly channeling family funds to keep her afloat. It explained how she had managed to maintain her facade so long. The trail of checks and signatures was undeniable. The boardroom at Horizon buzzed with tension as documents were laid out. My father's name appeared in black ink alongside shell company accounts. Rachel looked at me, her eyes sharp. "This ties directly to the collapse," she whispered. I nodded, though my stomach clenched. The next time the Whitman family name hit the news, it wasn't about Emily's charm or another one of her appearances. It was about fraud, lawsuits, and financial misconduct. The empire they had worked so hard to polish was crumbling piece by piece, not by my hand but by their own. That evening I received a call from my mother. Her voice was thin, frayed by sleepless nights. "Claire," she said, "what are you doing? They're saying terrible things about your sister. About your father." I listened, my hand steady on the phone. "I'm not doing anything," I answered. "The truth is speaking for itself," she pleaded, then her words tangled. "Can't you use your influence to make it stop? Can't you call someone?" I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch. All my life she had asked me to carry burdens that were never mine, to protect Emily, to protect their image. "Not anymore," I said. "The only thing I will protect is what I built. The rest is yours to face." She hung up without saying goodbye. The following week, Horizon requested I present again, this time at a closed meeting with potential partners and regulators. I walked into the room with a binder of documents, charts, and compliance reports. Across the table sat men and women in tailored suits, their eyes sharp and expectant. I showed them everything: growth metrics, security, audits, user testimonials. Then I laid down the papers that tied Emily's companies and my father's accounts, into a knot of deception. Gasps spread around the table. One regulator leaned back in his chair, his voice clipped. This could open formal investigations. I nodded calm. Transparency was the only way forward. When the meeting ended, the room emptied into hurried whispers. Rachel touched my arm and said quietly, "You didn't just protect us, you finished what they started." Driving back along the freeway to Malibu, I rolled the windows down. The wind rushed, entangling my hair, the sun painting the sky in streaks of orange. I thought of Emily's smug smile the night she told me to get out of my father's silence, of my mother's laughter brushing everything away. They had built their empire on my silence, and now it was breaking on the strength of my voice. That night I stood on the terrace, the ocean dark and endless beneath me. My laptop buzzed with messages from journalists, investors, old classmates I hadn't heard from in years. I ignored them all. Instead, I poured a glass of wine and leaned against the railing, listening to the tide. For the first time, I felt no trace of doubt. The reckoning was here, and I didn't have to lift a finger to force it. Their own choices had done the work, and as the waves crashed steady below, I knew the next chapter was already writing itself. The headlines multiplied faster than I could read them. Whitman Enterprises under investigation. Former clients sue Emily Whitman for fraud. Local bank cuts ties with Whitman family board. Each morning, the articles stacked higher on my phone. Each evening, the television anchors recited their downfall with the same careful cadence they once used to praise them. At first, I tried to keep my distance. I turned off notifications, focused on meetings, and walked the bluff trails near the house to quiet my thoughts. But the calls kept coming. Some from journalists, others from people I hadn't spoken to in years. College classmates who claimed to always believe in me. Distant relatives asking for my side of the story. Even old neighbors who wanted a quote. I declined them all. One afternoon, as I returned from the market with bags of fruit and bread, I found an envelope slipped under my front gate. The handwriting was Emily's, looping and careful. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm drowning. Please meet me." For a long while I stood in the kitchen holding the note. The refrigerator hummed behind me, gulls cried overhead, and I felt the pull of memory. She had once clung to me when thunderstorms rattled our old roof, begging me not to leave her side. But she had also laughed as she told me to get out, her glass raised high while our parents looked on. I didn't reply. 2 days later, she found another way. A voicemail landed on my phone, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Claire, it's me. I can't stop it. They're tearing everything apart. Please, I need your help." I deleted it without listening to the end. Meanwhile, Horizon's board moved swiftly. Regulators requested full records. I spent long nights with Marcus, combing through contracts, highlighting every clean line, preparing for scrutiny. Rachel reminded me gently that this was the cost of growth, that transparency would protect us. I nodded, though. Part of me still trembled from years of being told to stay quiet. Then came the broadcast that changed everything. Emily appeared on a national morning show, sitting rigid on a cream-colored couch. Her makeup was heavy, her smile strained. She told the host she had always supported her sister, even when I resented her, even when I disappeared. She said she had never turned her back on me. The host pressed about the lawsuits, about the birthday video now circulating online. Emily's eyes welled on cue. She said she was betrayed not by her family but by the narrative. I didn't flinch watching it. I simply muted the television and folded laundry at the kitchen table. But online, the reaction was swift. People replayed the birthday video again and again. They pointed to her words against the images, the laughter, the moment she told me to leave. Commentators called it the mask slipping. By evening, 2 of her sponsors had dropped her. The nonprofit where she sat on the board released a statement saying she was suspended indefinitely. That night I walked the terrace under a wide moon. The sea glittered, silver waves steady as breath. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I let it ring, then listened to the voicemail. It was my father this time. His voice was lower than I remembered, roughened by something I couldn't name. He said, "Your sister is struggling. You should step in, Claire. This family needs you." I set the phone on the railing and stared at the water. The nerve of it. All those years of silence, all those nights carrying weight that wasn't mine, and now he wanted me to step in. The next morning, Rachel found me in the studio flipping through old sketches. She placed a mug of coffee by my elbow and asked softly, "Are you okay?" I nodded, then shook my head. "They want me to save them," I whispered. She rested a hand on my shoulder. "You don't owe them rescue. You already rescued yourself." Her words stayed with me as the days unfolded. Lawsuits multiplied. Investigations opened. News anchors used the phrase, "crumbling empire." The Whitman name, once a symbol of polish and charm, had become shorthand for deceit. One evening, sitting by the fire pit with a blanket over my shoulders, I thought about the years spent in that damp corner room, the radiator clanging, the fan pushing stale air. They had given me silence then, and I had turned it into stone. Now their empire was breaking against it. The flames flickered, the ocean stretched wide, and I let myself breathe without the weight of their voices. The storm was theirs now, not mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely unbound. The morning after the last broadcast about Emily's lawsuits, I woke to sunlight streaming through the glass doors of my Malibu bedroom. The ocean stretched wide and calm, as if it had not heard a word of the chaos unraveling elsewhere. I brewed coffee and carried it out to the terrace, the steam rising against the cool air. For once I did not check the headlines. I let the world turn without me. In the studio by the stairwell, the scholarship fund documents waited. I signed them that afternoon, the pen steady in my hand. The left of the stairwell fund would support young women in STEM, those overlooked, underestimated, or told to stay quiet, like I once was. I pictured a girl sitting in a library corner with ambition burning in her chest, unsure if anyone would ever believe in her. Now she would have a door to walk through. Tess, my attorney and old friend, flew in from Chicago to finalize the details. She sat at the kitchen island with her glasses low on her nose hair, pulled back, wearing one of my sweatshirts like she always did when visiting. She looked up from the paperwork and said, "You're giving them what you never had." I smiled faintly. Or maybe I'm just making sure silence doesn't win again. While Tess reviewed contracts, I wandered into the living room. The piano sat untouched near the wide windows. I pressed one key, then another, soft notes filling the space. I had never learned to play, but I liked the sound, simple and unpolished, echoing against the walls that now belonged to me alone. Days blended into a rhythm. Meetings with Horizon, quiet dinners on the terrace, long walks along the bluff. Sometimes Rachel visited, bringing updates from the team. Marcus called once a week to talk compliance and laugh about the irony of being labeled the strict one. They kept the company thriving, and I stayed where I was most comfortable, behind the curtain. One evening, as I lit the fire pit, my phone buzzed again. A number from Dallas. I let it go to voicemail. Later, with the flames crackling, I listened. It was my mother. Her voice was softer than before, strained with something that sounded like regret, but never quite reached apology. She spoke of the house feeling empty, of Emily's silence, of my father's bitterness. She asked if I might come home just once to sit at the table again. I deleted the message. The past had taught me that some doors once closed were not meant to be reopened. My home was here now, not in a house that had mistaken my strength for invisibility. Weeks later, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a framed photo of me at 16, grease on my cheek, at a robotics competition, smiling at the camera alone. I set it on the shelf in my studio. That girl had waited years for someone to notice her. Now I noticed her every day. The empire they tried to build was gone, and mine stood quietly by the ocean, not gilded with their approval, but grounded in truth. I no longer needed their recognition. The work spoke. The silence carried. As the year turned and the waves kept rolling, I let the past settle where it belonged. The storm had passed, the reckoning finished. What remained was freedom, the kind built brick by brick out of resilience, not permission. If you have ever been pushed out of the place you thought was your home, I wonder what you would do. Would you fight to be let back in, or would you build a new door for yourself? I would love to hear your story. If any part of mine spoke to you, leave a comment. share it, or subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the furthest.